Hello and welcome to EJC News Focus, coming from IARC in Lyon, where the latest edition of the European Code Against Cancer was produced. In essence, it's 12 action points aimed at the general public, which if followed could dramatically cut cancer. But the simple appearance of the code belies the efforts behind it. These are detailed in full in a cancer epidemiology supplement. I met supplement editor Joachim Schutz and asked him first what's new about this issue of the code.
So there's actually a lot of new things in the new version of the code. First of all, the last update was from 2003, so we had 10 years of scientific evidence to review to make sure that all the knowledge on how to prevent cancer is captured in the new version of the code. We have included specific expertise in this code dealing with the communication of the recommendations. So we wanted these recommendations to be clearly understood by the general population audience, so that they can understand what they can do to reduce their cancer risk. And we have provided in this version of the code an additional section on questions and answers to further specify what the recommendations mean. So for instance, when we are talking about physical activity, we give a definition of how much physical activity you have to do so that it's beneficial for reducing your cancer risk.
Larry van Karser, also at IARC, was a co-editor of the supplement. I asked him how each bullet point was decided.
Well, it starts with sort of looking at the whole, the whole spectre, the whole framework of cancer prevention, and thinking about putting the groups of experts together to cover the whole field, so there are not any major gaps, and then picking the right experts, getting representation across Europe, getting people who are knowledgeable of the field, who are aware of new developments, but also have quite a lot of experience. So when the right groups are put together, then they need to come together and ask the right questions. What are the key issues now that are still relevant for cancer prevention for the general population? And when the questions are agreed, that actually that's a lot of the effort, focusing on the key questions. When those are nailed down, then it's rather easy to look at the evidence. And the evidence is also, of course, a problem because there's been quite a lot since the last update. In fact, we came across over 500,000 publications on cancer prevention. But fortunately at IARC and in a few other places, there are very comprehensive reviews. So by concentrating on these compendia, we were actually able to have a manageable job and to narrow down the actual questions where we had to do our own systematic reviews to a manageable number.
Why is it difficult to come up with the questions?
One of the values of the code is that it was a limited number of recommendations. It's something memorable that people can keep in mind. Many types of cancer prevention are not as easy as screening, where one just has to remember to go to the screening, to go to the screening program when the invitation arrives. In fact, it requires changes in lifestyle. It actually requires people to be aware of things. So having a memorable code means it has to be very limited in scope. And so then the challenge is, what questions are important enough to actually be on that code?
Were there particularly difficult areas?
Well, there was very little disagreement on the scientific evidence. So I think here all the groups came up with relatively straightforward recommendations and backed up by clear scientific evidence. We had more discussion really about how to phrase the recommendations in a way that it's understood by the general population. And we also had some discussion also whether this is a recommendation that is good to make for the general population, or whether this should be a recommendation where we use other kind of pathways for communication, like specifically to a high-risk group, or where the message is actually more to regulatory bodies than the general population. So if you think about air pollution, which is clearly another established cause of cancer, there's relatively little the individual can do to reduce your own cancer risk. So here the message should rather go to regulatory bodies and decision makers that for the entire population this agent has to be tackled.
Well, take for example liver cancer prevention. In some parts of Europe, it's a much bigger problem. In Southern Europe, for example, how frequent is hepatitis B and hepatitis C infection is more frequent in certain areas. Or gastric cancer, there are pockets of the population in Eastern Europe, in Spain, in Portugal and Italy, where the burden of Helicobacter is much higher than across Europe. So actually that was a sort of question that, well, we realized we needed to look at it, because if you're aware of the problem, you can do something about it. But it wasn't one of the questions that we had to look at for the code itself, for that key list of recommendations.
Screening, and in particular breast screening, has been very controversial. Did that cause debates within the group?
Well, I wouldn't say debate, because of course the experts involved in this are quite aware of the discussion and also the evidence. So we naturally revisited all of the evidence, and we were very careful in the communication, in the explanation about screening, in the questions and answers to also elucidate these issues. And also to indicate quite clearly that screening is not perfect, but the only screening that is recommended in the code are those screenings for which the evidence shows that the benefit far outweighs the risk.
But why have the code at all? Christopher Wilde, Director of IARC.
What the code does is provide an authoritative evaluation of the scientific evidence under the auspices of the International Agency for Research on Cancer. And it says if you come to look here and you look at this code, you will find things that the best scientists in Europe have judged will reduce your cancer risk.
The code, of course, it's a page of recommendations, it's a body of knowledge accessible for the general public, but it's not something that replaces the need for everyone to promote effective cancer prevention. So we hope it will reinforce those actions, and we think it can, and so we think it's a very positive thing.
We estimate that by following the recommendations, you can reduce your cancer risk at least by a third and maybe even up to 50%. And even if you follow some of the recommendations, it will be highly beneficial for reducing the risk of a disease that is very fatal and that is, of course, a high burden for the population and also for the individual.
So 12 points that could dramatically change the landscape of cancer in Europe. And with thanks to all our interviewees, that's it for this month's EJC News Focus.